I'm delighted today to be joined by David Smith, economics editor of the Sunday Times. David, lovely to have you with us.
Mark, it's great to be talking to you. It's been a busy time since Rachel Reeves's budget speech, but I've always got time to talk to you, and it's nice to be here.
David, what was Rachel Reeves trying to achieve with this budget?
I think it's a good question because the answer to it, I think, is not straightforward. I think firstly, if you think about the pressure that was on both her and the Prime Minister Keir Starmer ahead of this, and that pressure, I think, reached its peak around the time that Rachel Reeves had that strange early morning press event in Downing Street when everybody assumed that she was going to put up income tax rates, by 2p in the pound across all rates. And of course, we did see an element of that, but only for selected groups, and we can talk about that later. But I think the answer is that once that had happened, and that was seen as possibly even a resignation offence for her, clearly breaking the manifesto, then I think things changed quite dramatically then, because I think it became a budget all about bolstering her position, bolstering her position within the party, so giving the party something. I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, one of the big announcements in the budget was the removal of this, two-child benefit cap, so that families on benefits with more than two children would now receive additional benefits for third and fourth children. That wasn't in the budget a couple of weeks ago, but that was put in, I think, with the aim of securing support from Labour backbenchers and taking some of that pressure on both Reeves and Starmer away. But the other thing, I think I've never come across a chancellor who is more aware of what's happening in the financial markets, in the gilt market, to government, the cost of government borrowing, and what the big investment banks are saying about the government. So she keeps in close touch with some of those big investment banks. So I think having a budget that did not have an adverse response from the financial markets was very important, and I think they will regard the response so far as quite a win in that respect. They didn't want a budget which was followed by a surge in the cost of government borrowing. Putting in the additional headroom to meet the fiscal rules was very important in that regard. So I think firstly, bolster her own and the Prime Minister's position. Secondly, do something which Labour MPs could support, and thirdly, make sure the markets are on side. And I think those were the three ambitions for this budget.
You mentioned the markets there. When you look at the stock market, the bond market, the currency markets, how have they reacted in the 48 hours since the budget?
Well, so far, and these things have a habit of turning, unexpectedly. But so far, the Treasury will be quite relieved by what has happened. Gilt yields, the cost of government borrowing fell quite sharply on the day of the budget. We had this peculiar early release. And when that early release came through, the instant reaction of the markets was for gilt yields to fall, because they saw the additional headroom that Rachel Reeves had put into her to meeting her fiscal rules, and that fall has been pretty much preserved as we speak. These things, as they can be reversed. Sterling is up a bit. Stock market has done okay. And all these things are, they're never as straightforward as markets move on quite quickly. They respond to an event like a budget, but then the next thing they're concerned with is something like the American jobs figures, or what they expect the American Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, to do. So they don't dwell on it in the same way that perhaps we do when we've got to digest all the implications of it. For them, it's a one-off event. And you think about every country has a budget. We build them up to things of huge importance in this country, but we don't think very much about the French or German budgets, for example. But they have an impact as well. But I think the early reaction was good, and that probably is the most you can get out of a budget for a chancellor. If the early reaction of the market is good, that's fine. It's a bit like when a chief executive is dismissed or resigns and the share price goes up. That's a bit of that is a contra signal. You want, and so in that respect, I think you should be quite pleased with the reaction of the markets.
And looking then at the job market, in the last few weeks, we've seen a small rise in unemployment and sadly a fall in the number of vacancies here in the UK. When you look at the budget and you look into 2026, where do you think those two parts of the market could go to?
Yeah. Well, if you know what, one of the things we are still grappling with, as you know, Mark, is the reliability of the figures for the job market, because we've got this, this thing which drives the numbers, the labour force survey, a big survey of, it used to be a bigger survey, and until they were met with low response rates, and that does show a small rise in unemployment. And the OBR, the official forecaster, expects that to continue for a little bit over the next few months. I think a lot of that, particularly in sectors like retail and hospitality, is still an effect of last year's budget. The increase in employers' national insurance, and more particularly the reduction in threshold at which national insurance is begins to be levied. That was very bad for sectors which employ a lot of relatively low paid and part-time workers, and that's still coming through. So you see, the number of people on payrolls has fallen, quite a bit over the last 12 months. Although the other measure, the labour force survey, suggests that employment is still rising. And the truth is somewhere in between. But we've moved away from the really rapid employment growth that we had in the 2010s, when we saw during the 2010s we saw nearly 4 million people added to the number of people in work in the UK. Now it's much more of a difficult grind, I think, for in getting employment out, particularly at that lower end. And of course, debates like the effect of AI and so on are starting to come in there. One of the things that post-budget things the government has done, which is quite helpful, I think, on this, is the proposed relaxation of one of the elements of the Employment Rights Bill, which there'll be no longer first day rights on unfair dismissal. And I think that was seen as a great barrier to employment by a lot of firms. I don't know whether this is something you've come across, but changing that to 6 months, as advocated by pretty much everybody, think tanks and so on, makes a lot of sense. There'll be a bit of a reaction against it in the Labour Party, but overall, I'm not too troubled by what's happening in the labour market. Because one of the other things I would mention is that the big thing that we saw in of the past few years has been this rise in economic inactivity. That's people who are not just they're not unemployed in a specific way, but they're outside the job market altogether. They're not available for work. And if you look at the percentage of people who are economically inactive of working age has fallen at the same time that unemployment has risen slightly. And I think they are two sides of the same coin. So people have moved off inactivity into being available for work. If there are not jobs immediately available, they become unemployed as opposed to inactive. So some of this, I think, is a little bit of a statistical a statistical adjustment in some ways. The other thing, you mentioned the fall in vacancies. It's not too long since we were faced with the tightest job market we've ever had in this country. Post-pandemic, lots of people had dropped out of the labour market. We'd lost the supply of EU workers because of Brexit, and those very self-same sectors like hospitality and retail, which are now, which have been protesting over the past year about the new taxes, the higher taxes. They were the ones who couldn't get anybody. You saw loads and loads of hospitality outlets, restaurants, cafes, and so on, just couldn't open because they couldn't get the workers. So we've moved away from that, and I think that is really why vacancies have fallen so much over the past 3 years. We've moved away from that exceptionally tight labour market to something which is more normal.
David, would you have expected more from the Chancellor to try and directly address the UK's challenge that it has and has had for many years around productivity, and perhaps link this with investment and a greater focus on artificial intelligence?
I think I would, yeah. And one of the debates which is kind of emerging, and I think one of the debates the Treasury probably doesn't like at the moment, is whether it's too focused on the finance side of its job and not enough focused on the kind of economic growth aspect of it. And so in a lot of other countries, you have a finance department and you have an economy department, and and we tried that. We've tried that, at different times over the years in the UK. We once had in the 1960s the Department of Economic Affairs. It didn't last very long. Gordon Brown, when he was Chancellor, said that what he wanted to one of the reasons he gave the Bank of England independence to take decisions on interest rates was they wanted the Treasury to be an economic ministry, focused on those drivers of productivity, those drivers of economic growth. And I think this was very much not that. This was a finance ministry budget, a budget focused on, fixing the public finances, leaving room for the fiscal rules to be met. There's very little in there that you could say was aimed at, how do you, for example, get AI more involved in the provision of public services. A lot of the think tanks like the Tony Blair Institute and so on would say that is the holy grail. If you can get, AI can do a lot of things, and it can do a lot of things particularly in areas where there's repetitive activity, and there's a lot of repetitive activity in the provision of public services. If you can switch a lot of that to AI, with all the safeguards and so on, then you can make a lot of difference. And I think it was disappointing there was nothing on that. And the other thing is that there was a great build-up from the time this government won the election to its industrial strategy, which was was intended to be all about raising productivity, focusing on the sectors in which we're really good. We have an advantage, a comparative advantage over other countries. And you rarely hear anything about the industrial strategy now. It was launched and then almost immediately forgotten. So I think that supply side, those supply side reforms, it's not comfortable. The Chancellor can blame the fact that the OBR downgraded its assumptions about productivity going forward on what's happened over the last decade and a half, not just what's happened over the last year and a half. But at the same time, it's uncomfortable for a government which is supposedly focusing on growth and focusing on productivity to have that downgrade. And I think you would struggle to find much there. I mean, I wouldn't dismiss everything that was there. One of the things that there are a couple of positive things I would say. One of which was the fact that if you look at the speech that Rachel Reeves gave, apart from all the fiddly things on tax and on spending, there was a recognition in there that the private sector is what drives economic growth. The private sector, individual risk takers, companies exploring new markets, and all those things. So the language was good. The delivery, I would say, less so. She also did something to try and encourage, some of the pension reforms that she's talking about are intended to encourage startups, to encourage pension funds to put more money into startups. And this thing about, new IPOs, new initial public offerings in London will be exempt from stamp duty for 3 years. That was an attempt to address what is now the London-New York problem, that all the attractive listings seem to be going to New York. So there were some supply side things, but I think they were relatively minor. There is no discernible and rigorous productivity agenda from this government, and there was none set out in the budget.
I was going to ask you about that 3-year stamp duty break for companies listing on the London Stock Exchange. We know over the recent years the number of companies listing in London has fallen significantly. Will that move the dial, do you think, or is it too insubstantial?
Well, I think it's an interesting way of testing the water. Everybody you talk to in the city, and they've said this for decades, is that remove stamp duty on share purchases. That will make an enormous difference to us. Now, it's quite nice. That would be, it wouldn't be cheap to do that, and it's also, the last thing that a Labour Chancellor like Rachel Reeves wanted to do in a budget which was tight and which was putting up taxes eventually on most people. We can talk about the eventually point in a moment if you like, but the last thing she wanted to do was to give a big concession to the city and to investors. But testing it out for these new IPOs is quite a good way of doing it. I mean, if it makes a difference to them, then that's an experiment which suggests it could make a difference more substantially, and might be the thing that the City of London is being held back by. So I think in that respect, it was quite a clever thing to do. If it doesn't make any difference at all, then, every time the city comes along and says, get rid of stamp duty, she can say, well, I did it for these and it didn't make any difference. If it does make a difference, then you go ahead with it on a wider scale. I mean, it's is it enough? The problems of you know London listings are usually thought of to be, we don't have a big enough investor or capital base, whereas in New York they do, and you get more attractive valuations there, which is why companies prefer New York listings. But so we'll see. But it's an interesting experiment, I think.
Consumers and businesses up and down the country obviously have a great focus and interest on where interest rates and inflation is heading. When you look at the budget, the comments from the OBR, what's your own personal opinion if you fast forward 12 months on where interest rates and inflation will be in the UK?
Yeah, I mean, she one of the ambitions that the Chancellor set out was to make this a cost of living budget. In other words, one that would reduce the cost of living. And we saw a few elements to that. One was the freeze from next year on regulated rail fares, also on prescription charges, and taking £150 of net zero type costs from energy bills and putting them into general taxation, and so taking them off those bills, and they will make a difference to inflation. I mean, there are two things happening at once in terms of the new official forecast. One is that the LBR decided that inflation was going to be a little bit higher than they expected back in March, and the period in which we'd be above the 2% target would last a bit longer. But the other one was that the budget clearly takes it down, so knocks 0.4% off inflation eventually. So I think the two things add up to, a picture in which, might not be a smooth ride, but I think we are moving towards lower inflation. The point at which we'll get down to 2% is probably late next year or early in 2027. And I think the Bank of England will be reassured by that. So certainly I would expect, there was nothing in the budget to stop the bank cutting again on December the 18th. It was close that they held rates last time in November. And I think everything we've had since, including, slightly below expectations, inflation, wage growth seems to be slowing. But there was nothing in the budget to stop them cutting rates, I think, and there were a couple of things which would encourage them to do so. So I would expect them to cut again, and I think we'll have a couple more cuts next year. So I think by this time next year we'll have a bank rate of about 3.25%, and inflation will be below that. Maybe not, and maybe not quite at the target, but getting very close to it. So I think the outlook for inflation and interest rates is pretty good at the moment. I think we had, and these things take time to feed through to the economy these days. I mean, it used to be the case that the impact of a cut in interest rates was instantaneous. Nowadays, you have to wait for we're still, a lot of people are still experiencing the backwash of the Liz Truss budget of 3 years ago, when that put up borrowing costs, fixed rate mortgages went up, and some people are still refixing this year and next year on those higher interest rates that were the result of that. But gradually the lower rates will feed through, and I think that will make a difference. I think that will be a significant driver of consumer spending and of growth more generally.
Well, I'm sure people will be pleased to hear that you think interest rates will come down and inflation will come down. What else is there in the budget and in what you're seeing that should give people and businesses confidence that things may improve a little bit next year?
Yeah, well, one thing I think is probably not accounted for enough in a lot of the commentary and a lot of the way that people analyse these things is the extent to which many of the things that were announced in the budget will not take effect for quite some time. So you think, I'm sure a lot of your, clients are concerned about, what's happening to salary sacrifice pension contributions. That's changed, and that new limit of £2,000. I mean, what the Chancellor and what the Treasury had in its sights there were, in particular, financial services sector, people in there putting their bonuses into salary sacrifice pensions and thus missing out on having to pay national insurance contributions. I think there's probably also quite a lot of bunching below the £100,000 level, if you can keep below the £100,000 level by making salary sacrifice pension contributions, that stops you getting into the 60% marginal rate of tax above there. That's one of the quirks of our system. So, but that won't take effect. The salary sacrifice change won't take effect till 2029. The additional freeze. I mean, I don't like the fact that income tax allowances and thresholds are going to be frozen for another 3 years. It makes the biggest stealth tax increase in history even bigger. But we're living with that already. This is not a change. The additional 3 years will kick in from 2028. Many of the other things, the additional 2p on income tax for landlords and one or two others, which gives an echo of what the budget might have been. We might have seen 2p on the rates of the basic rate, the higher rate, and the additional rate, if not for, I think, what was quite a late rethink on whether it was sensible to raise income tax. But that won't start till April 2027. So there's time to think about that. There's time to think about all these things, and that means that I think she has, in the best way she's able to do, by delaying most of these things, she's given the economy a bit of room to grow. There's not going to be an immediate tax hit. I think if income tax rates had gone up, then that would have been in either next April or in April 2027, and people would have looked forward to that with some trepidation. The danger in all this is that people hear the announcements, think these things are going to happen straight away, and start to feel miserable because of that. But I would have thought generally, you look at the business response to this budget, and it's quite positive because it wasn't more negative. The budget wasn't more negative for them. So the absence of bad news is for many businesses quite good news, in contrast to what was the case a year ago. And I think that should also be the case for for most consumers. It could have been worse. It could have been quite a lot worse. And I think there is a bit of a relief thing here. Consumer confidence and business confidence have been pretty battered by the build up to the budget. People have been uncertain. Businesses have been uncertain about whether to invest, whether this is the time to recruit and expand. But even in the short time we've had since the budget, we've had announcements of expansions. Some of them were obviously intended anyway. But I think that that lag between the announcement and the tax changes taking effect is actually quite positive for the next couple of years. There is room for the economy to grow, and if, as I was saying, if those interest rate cuts come through, then that provides an additional impetus. So I think. A lot of the response to the budget has been very gloomy. I think from an economic perspective, we shouldn't be too gloomy, and also from a labour market perspective. I mean, this could have been much worse. It's there weren't more negatives. We knew there was going to be a tax raising budget. Businesses feared they would be hit again in quite a big way. That didn't happen. The tax increases are mainly delayed, and we seem to have got rid of the kind of air of permanent crisis that has surrounded this government and the public finances and the financial markets. So all that, I think, is reasonably positive. I don't think we should respond to this. It's almost instinctive to say, taxes are going up. We're going to have eventually the highest tax burden in history. That's bad news. In time, it is bad news, but it's gradual, and this could have been a lot worse. And I think I think for many businesses, the appropriate reaction to this is a bit of a sigh of relief. I think there'll be things to complain about, but there'll also be things that's to be not displeased about. I think nobody's going to throw their hats in the air as a result of this budget. This government doesn't encourage such behaviour really, but I think it's not as bad as it could have been. So that's the lesson I would draw from it, I think.
And do you think on that basis, so with Rachel Reeves not pushing for a rise in income tax, that she's saved her political skin and perhaps therefore Keir Starmer's political skin?
Yeah.
But perhaps then when we've got the May elections next year, there's obviously speculation that if they are, as the polls predict, disastrous for the Labour Party and the Labour government, that we could see a leadership challenge. And you can never separate the politics from the economics. And it's therefore feasible that in 6 months' time we could have a new Prime Minister and a new Chancellor. Is that possible in your mind?
Yeah, it is. It's certainly possible, and I think it would be unfortunate. Now, I don't have any particular axe to grind on their behalf. I don't know. Of all the prime ministers I've worked, when I've been working, I know him the least, I would say, and I don't know Rachel Reeves as well as, for example, Jeremy Hunt. I mean, we think about who we had in place before the last election, before the election last year, and and Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt, both of whom I knew very well, and I still see Jeremy, and Rishi is now a co-columnist on the Sunday Times. So we it's and you think about that, that when they were in place, things seemed okay, and but the problem was with them that you didn't know how long, if the Tories had scraped back in, you didn't know how long they would last, because they were both, even though they were competent, very competent, they weren't popular within the party, and they would have run the risk of the kind of thing you're talking about for Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves. So I think the danger is the political stability. The government would say, and Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer would say, that what we've got a chance now to deliver is the stability that we all talked about 18 months ago. And that stability will bring benefits in terms of economic growth, in terms of opinion poll ratings, and all those things. If there is regicide after the May elections, then all that starts to go away. So I think it's that is the risk. I think at the moment, that's the risk.
David, we're seeing some positive news with regards to a potential peace deal between Russia and Ukraine. And I think we're all very hopeful that can come true. What impact could that have on the UK and European economies if a peace deal is secured?
Well, I think the spectre of Ukraine and the Russia-Ukraine war has been hanging over us for more than 3 years now, and it's obviously had an economic effect. It initially pushed up inflation. It's caused concern. I think this will be greeted quite positively in terms of one of the an end to some of the uncertainty that we're experiencing at the moment. So I think that would be positive, but also. One of the things that wasn't really addressed in the budget was the fact that we're going to have to spend a lot more on defence. And if you look at the NATO commitment to spending 5% of GDP on defence, whereas we're just creeping up to 2.6% now, that's a lot of money. And there isn't room for that within the present government plan. So I think there are a lot of I think Europeans and the UK are quite willing to spend more on defence, but 5% looks a bit high that quickly, by the middle of the 2030s. So I think there is also a view that once Trump has gone and once there is peace in Ukraine, maybe some of that pressure is eased. I think we're quite happy to spend more, 3.5% of GDP, but maybe there will be less impetus to spend quite so much on defence. So that will also be positive. Not of course for the defence industries, which are doing quite well out of all this international turbulence, but I think there would be a positive effect. It's just and anybody should regard it as positive. An end to the killing, an end to any war. We've seen that with Gaza as well. So we should, it would help. I think definitely.
Thank you. We know we've struggled for growth in the economy over a number of years. Obviously, if we go back to the banking crisis, public debt increased. There was the impact of Brexit and obviously the significant impact of COVID. There's always a group of people that will argue for sort of a radical reimagining of the UK economy. Is that politically and economically naive and daft to think and suggest that, or is it possible?
Yeah, it's quite interesting that a lot of people talked about reimagining when we were doing well, and that and that's the last time you're going to do it. When you're doing well, you're quite happy to continue as you are. When you're doing badly, sometimes there is there is a need to do something really radical. I mean, you take the what's happening in Argentina. The chainsaw leader there. Argentina has been a country in and out of IMF support for many years. It's had currency runs, currency devaluations, financial crises, and we would never want that to happen to us. We never want to be in that situation. But I think there is some people would say, we've just got to go back to how we used to be, and how we used to be includes, of course, being members of the EU. But I always say to people I didn't support, I opposed the exit from the EU, but that ship has sailed. You can't now imagine a situation, particularly with Reform UK ahead in the polls, where any other parties would say, we need to go back into the EU, even though I think, the public view on that is that it has damaged us, and, the public has turned against Brexit. But the EU, that if we tried to rejoin the EU that we would rejoin would be different from the one we left. We wouldn't have the same terms of membership and so on. And in many ways, we left the EU because even then, people wanted change. They wanted something better. I don't think they necessarily thought we could be Singapore on Thames, but they thought we could do better than we were. And so I think we've still got to make up our minds as a country. Do we want to be more highly taxed and have better public services and be like the Scandinavian countries, which happen to be, according to most surveys, the happiest countries in the world? Or do we want to be more like America, where there's less, public services are less good, taxes are lower, and there's more of a kind of survival of the fittest mentality? At the moment, the irony of Brexit really is that, we've left the EU, but in many ways, certainly in terms of public spending relative to GDP, certainly in terms of economic growth, we've moved closer to EU countries, the big EU countries, than moved away from them, certainly closer to them than we are to America at the moment. So I think there is, somebody at some stage, one of the disappointments about the kind of alternative parties that we've got in the UK at the moment, Reform and the Greens in particular, is that they don't really have any kind of credible policies for reimagining the country. It is all from a kind of either a standard, ultra left playbook or a standard ultra right playbook. It's you have to ask whether any of it is practicable. So I think the need to do something different is there. But maybe it's the sort of thing I should be writing about more than just commenting on budgets and so on. So I think you give me a good idea there, Mark, for future columns. Yeah.
Well, thank you, David. Immigration seems to be right at the top of opinion polls as perhaps the most important matter to the British public at the moment. There's obviously a lot of talk about small boat crossings. You mentioned Brexit and people moving from the EU and working into the UK. There's also a lot of talk in the press about wealthy people moving out of the UK and moving to countries such as the UAE and Singapore. Are you able just to take a step back and try and give us some data, some facts, some economic evidence of what's really going on with immigration and the impact it's having on the UK economy?
Yeah, I mean, the numbers have changed quite a lot. So, we obviously a lot of people came in the, what was known as the Boris wave. People from, three things were happening there. People were welcomed in from Ukraine. People were welcomed in from Hong Kong if they had certain passports. And I think there was a determination when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister not to allow Brexit to get in the way of firms needing workers and so on. But it didn't work quite as well as it should have done, because as we were talking about just now, there were severe worker shortages once we left the EU. The ones that came in on work visas were not necessarily the same as the ones who left. But what's happened now is that the latest figures we got is that net migration into the UK was just over 200,000 in the latest 12 months. And that's much lower than it was. That mainly reflects, visa restrictions and family member restrictions introduced by the previous government on, students coming in, can't bring family members in, nor can care workers and so on. So I think they have, that effect is there. But also, it was always, people like me always said, well, there's too much focus on small boat crossings and asylum seekers, but the result of the big fall in net migration is that suddenly asylum seekers represent a really big chunk of the number of people coming in. You know, the asylum seekers come in but don't leave. Students come in and do leave. You know, foreign students, young people, British young people are leaving. I think that's, you know, they are more than are arriving. Some of those are leaving to study abroad, but some are leaving because they see better opportunities elsewhere. And that, in terms of the future of the country, that's a bit depressing, I think. You know, you don't want all your young people going to Dubai or Portugal or wherever, or Australia, you know, which is apparently is where a lot of NHS workers go, because it's, you know, working in the Australian health services is more attractive than working in the National Health Service. So I think losing talent is always bad. On the you know, the wealthier side of it, I think it was always the case that you know, the bridge too far in terms of clamping down on non-doms was to the idea that they would be subject to inheritance tax on all their worldwide assets. I mean, that was always a really strange thing to do. If you are you know, naming no names, an Indian billionaire or trillionaire, and you've got massive amounts of money, and also it's spread around the world, the last thing you want is for your worldwide assets to be subject to UK inheritance tax, you know, when you pass away. So I think that was a strange thing to do. It was an open invitation for certain non-doms to leave the country, and some have done so. On the other hand, as somebody was saying to me yesterday, you know, you know, a lot of Americans with wealth seem to be coming to the UK to escape Donald Trump, you know. So it's, you know, so the London property market seems to be benefiting from that, as is the Cotswolds property market. You know, I don't know whether it's yet affecting your area, Mark, but it's certainly starting to happen, you know. So there is a two-way flow there. But you know, if you lose people for the wrong reason, obviously, you know, net migration coming down is good for the government, but they won't be seen to have solved the problem until you've reduced the number of asylum seekers in hotels, until those small boat crossings are clearly down, until some sort of agreement with France has worked. But you know, part of the problem in terms of immigration and the issue of immigration has just been the sheer numbers, and reducing those numbers has to be, you know, a step in the right direction for the government, I think.
David, looking ahead to 2026 and beyond, what are the most credible reasons to be positive and optimistic about the UK economy?
Well, I think the most credible reasons are that we've come through a couple of big shocks in the so far in the 2020s. You know, it certainly hasn't been the Roaring '20s, which I think was what Boris Johnson once promised. And the shocks, of course, were the pandemic and the Russian invasion, which gave us that high inflation. I think we've come through those. We've also come through another shock, which is the shock of moving from, you know, near zero interest rates to, you know, pre-crisis levels of interest rates. You know, a bank rate peak of more than 5%, which was a big adjustment for the economy. Now, you know, assuming, and it's probably a brave assumption, that we can now move into a kind of a more shock-free period, and as we were talking earlier, you know, those interest rate cuts will start to feed through. You know, if this is, you know, if we can have a period of normality, if somehow, you know, the Chancellor and Prime Minister can head off pressure to dislodge them from their positions from within the Labour Party, then a period of stability, a period of political and financial and market stability will, I think, help businesses plan for the future. It will help them, you know, they'll think about, you know, who they want to recruit, where they want to invest, where they want to expand, and all those things. So, you know, let's just have a bit of normality. If we have normality, I think I'm quite positive for prospects in 2026. If we have an ongoing kind of, you know, everybody ever uses the word psychodrama, if we have an ongoing psychodrama within the Labour Party, then I think you know, we'll still be stuck in you know, a very low growth environment, and businesses and consumers will not want to take any risks. So it's in the balance, but on balance, I am positive about prospects for 2026.
Well, David, if you're positive, I'm positive. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mark.
I hope you enjoyed today's conversation and found it both thought-provoking and insightful. No doubt many of the ideas and themes we discussed will impact you and your businesses into 2026. If you'd like to get in touch with us here at Eaton Bridge Partners, we look forward to hearing from you.